ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's semi-final debate. My name is Rachel Golder and I am the chairman of this debate. The timekeeper is Danielle McGregor. The debate will be judged by a panel of 3 adjudicators who are Mr Morton, Mrs Lowen and Mr Hazel. The topic of this debate is that the Victoria Police should not have billed the organisers of the Lauren, Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Nuriootpa High School and the negative team from my left is from St Peter's Girls College. The speaking time for this debate is 8 minutes. A single bell will sound when 1 minute before the speaking time and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. Please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Cassie Taylor.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the Victoria Police should not have billed the organisers of the Lauren, Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. This evening, as the affirmative team, we strongly agree with this statement. The affirmative team defines this topic to mean that the Victorian Police, a body of law enforcement who describe their mission as to serve the Victorian community and uphold the law so as to promote a safe, secure and orderly society, should not have charged the organisers of the Lauren, Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour, Axiomatic, $67,842.50 before the event took place in Melbourne on July 20th this year. This action was performed in accordance with the Victoria Police Fees and Charges Regulations made in 2014. Additionally, for future reference, the affirmative team will refer to the monetary amount as $68,000. Again, the affirmative team sees this statement as undoubtedly true. As first speaker this evening, I will explain to you how the decision to charge Axiomatic before the event even took place was an extreme act on behalf of the Victoria Police that follows a dangerous precedent for controversial events in Victoria, and how such action threatens and undermines free speech and democracy within Australia. Our second affirmative speaker, Jess, will explain how Axiomatic were not at fault of the threat damage caused by protesters, and that the amount charged by the police was extremely out of proportion to the services provided. Our third speaker, Georgia, will refute the arguments presented by the negative team and summarise our team case. Our first argument this evening revolves around the act conducted by the Victoria Police of billing Axiomatic prior to the event taking place in Melbourne, with this being the second highly publicised incident of charging organisers for a controversial event. Following the introduction of regulation allowing this in 2014, which states that the Chief Commissioner, in accordance with this regulation, may impose charges for services provided by police officers and Victoria Police employees who are deployed for sporting, entertainment or any other events. Police have mostly used this as a means to charge major sporting events hundreds of thousands of dollars to employ resources and ensure public safety, which is generally required due to the risk of those attending the event to behave in an antisocial manner. It's following a report about the dramatic monetary loss by the Victorian Police by the Herald Sun in 2015, it can be seen that major sporting events which require extensive protection by the police may warrant a contribution to their protection. However, for the ticketed event that was promoted by Axiomatic, however, disruptive behaviour was not expected from those actually attending the event. As second speaker Jess will elaborate further, the event's location was kept secret from even the attendees in order to help ensure a peaceful event without major altercations with protesters. The reason I mention this is because my first argument is on how the burqa, in the occurrence of any incidents within the event itself, Southern had promoting the hiring of a security team on Twitter which had handled all prior shows to Melbourne successfully. With this regulation only reportedly being triggered for major sporting events and controversial figures to date such as Stefan and Molyneux, it is worth considering, ladies and gentlemen, whether the Victoria Police is using this in order to deter controversial activists from hosting events within the city itself. Other than major sporting events, the only other time the police have reportedly used this regulation has been on conservative individuals such as Milo Yiannopoulos, Stefan, Molyneux, and most recently this week, Conservative UK politician Nigel Farage. With When events such as Julia Gillard's and Hillary Clinton speaking tour in May this year was threatened with violence and protest over social media, the event was protected by Victorian police and in-house security. The organisers of the event were not reportedly charged for this police presence. Similarly, with unpopular figures in industries such as music, it's unheard of for the police to charge the organisers for rowdy or antisocial individuals on the streets. Additionally, in every other Southern and Molyneux event throughout Australia and New Zealand, whilst protests had been planned by the Campaign of Racism and Fascism in cities such as Brisbane and Perth, the police in every other state could seemingly handle it. At the end of the day, this trend of charging conservative and controversial acts for holding events in Melbourne is a worrying trend for Australia, and can undoubtedly suggest a bias by the Victoria Police. Whilst charging event organisers may sometimes be useful for the police to maintain sustainability as a force in occasions such as sporting events, the Southern and Molyneux event should not have had their free speech targeted and charged $68,000 by the Victoria Police. My second point this evening refers to the idea of being forced to pay tens of thousands of dollars to police prior to hosting a ticketed event, just because of the proposed backlash from other Australians. Ladies and gentlemen, it's extremely important to consider Australian values when it comes to democracy and free speech here. In the case of Southern and Molyneux, the idea of charging an event $68,000 for resources before it even took place is extremely unwarranted, especially when taking into account that the initial figure the Victorian Police was going to charge them was an exceedance of $200,000. Whilst this was announced by Southern herself, and whilst this was a biased stance by Southern as part of the controversy, this is still valid due to the evidence presented of the police sending her letters announcing this. Whilst it is good that the police decided to lower their amount, it is alarming to think about why they were so prepared to charge Axiomatic with a figure which may or may not have been needed on the night of the event. It is extremely fortunate in this case that Axiomatic had the means to seek legal advice upon receiving this charge, which stated that the event can go ahead and the amount did not need to be paid beforehand. This trend of intimidating acts into submission by the police through the means of charging them tens of thousands of dollars prior is an extremely alarming and dangerous precedent for Australian democracy. The Victoria Police could have just as easily charged Axiomatic after the event had taken place, and the police could accurately see the resources actually needed. Additionally, the billing of controversial acts for anticipated protests sets a dangerous precedent for any future controversial events, where if the knowledge that protesting will oppress someone financially becomes widespread, of course protesters who wish to see an impact will be able to do so by protesting at the event and costing the hosts thousands of dollars, potentially in the tens of thousands. As Jess will clarify later, the protest was predominantly organised by the Campaign Against Racism and Fascism, showing that a designated protest group has every opportunity to take advantage of this. As I explained earlier, ladies and gentlemen, the affirmative team does see a benefit in the contribution from the party which hosts an event such as sports, as it is large scale, and there is a chance for some antisocial behaviour afterwards. However, charging a much smaller speaking tour before it even takes place in anticipation of protesters they had no control over is damning for Australian democracy as we know it, and Axiomatic on behalf of Southern and Molyneux should not have been charged for this speaking tour in Melbourne. In conclusion, Axiomatic should not have been charged by the Victoria Police at all, and they especially should never have been charged so much. My arguments this evening have shown how billing an event for so much money prior to it even taking place is preposterous, and that undermines freedom of speech in democracy and not only Victoria, but Australian culture as a whole. The precedent of only being able to speak if you pay for it and say the right things, set by Victoria Police and charging controversial figures such as Southern and Molyneux, creates a path of silencing controversial voices entirely. As a result, the organisers for the Stefan and Molyneux event should not have been billed by the Victorian Police prior to their event.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Sophie Orupt.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, adjudicator, timekeeper and chairperson. The topic for tonight's debate is that the Victoria Police should not have billed the organisers of the Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. We, the negative team, strongly disagree with this statement. Our team's definition of the topic is that on the 20th of July, alt-right commentators and justice activists, Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux, held a forum in Melbourne to communicate their own ideologies to a large audience and were billed $67,842.50 for the use of police resources. The event organisers we define policing as the actions of the event security or a police or group of an authority to ensure fairness and legality in an area of public life. Additionally, we define billing as the total amount of cost of goods or services billed to a customer. Before I continue with my speech this evening, I'd like to point out some flaws in the opposition's argument. The first affirmative speaker tried to tell you that by being billed, it was damaging. However, you referred to the presenters as being controversial. It was actually the event's nature that would clearly cause violence, and as I will discuss further, this was the case. Also, how is cancelling events as a result of billing to the organisers bad for the public? We don't wish for extremist values to be spread among Australians. This in fact breaches the freedom of speech of human right, and our second speaker, Neve, will further discuss this. Now, onto my first topic tonight, that events such as this are notorious for violence. Let's take fellow Canadian right-wing commentator Gavin McInnes, who was touring Australia in November. Guests have been warned of similar protests, with McInnes saying blatantly, "People will show up, and if they want to fight, I'm happy to fight." Let's now take Milo Yiannopoulos' event in Melbourne. Up to 300 police were called in to separate protesters when fights broke out outside his show. Police were pelted with rocks, glass bottles and sticks and were forced to use capsicum spray. Miss Southern was expected to cause trouble too, with the alt-right YouTube star making headlines since she touched down in Australia. The 23-year-old arrived in Brisbane wearing an "It's okay to be white" t-shirt, after news.com.au warned that she would undoubtedly cause chaos with her notorious brand of free speech. No city's left activists were more determined to wreak havoc at Southern and Molyneux's event than in Melbourne. The campaign against racism and fascism led the charge, who are associated with the left-wing terrorist group Antifa. After countless venues cancelled the tour, organiser Axiomatic Events eventually were able to host the Melbourne event at La Mirage in Somerton in the city's far north. These groups still made the trip north and blocked buses travelling to the venue, damaged private property, and yelled obscenities at those attending. On July 21st, police wearing riot gear and carrying shields faced off with around 200 anti-fascist protesters who tried to stop buses entering a Melbourne reception centre where the speakers launched their tour. Mounted police and police dogs were also used to help control the crowd members who booed and swore at buses and cars, bringing people to the event. According to news.com.au, both people were considered to be a part of the culture war, a series of disagreements over the West's acceptance of political correctness, immigration, feminism, gender theory and multiculturalism. This leads me to my second point, is that Lauren Southern was initially denied of an Australian visa. Look at her history of violent protests across the world and her banning from the United Kingdom. Lauren's presence in the United Kingdom was not conducive to the public good. She also tried her hand at speaking in New Zealand, but was later denied entry by the Mayor of Auckland, Phil Goff, as the Auckland Council believed that she, along with her companions, would only stir up religious and ethnic tensions. Lauren herself has engaged in as many protests and political stunts as her enemies. Her rants have been described by members of the public as hate speech. The campaign against racism and fascism have also labelled her a notorious racist and Islamophobe. It was Australia who gifted Lauren an opportunity to present to the public and spread her values according to freedom of speech. So as a result of being invited to speak in Australia, after a shocking history, the least that she could do was respect the system of the Victoria Police, that being accepting the costs of spreading, and I repeat again, hate speech.
Southern has also been criticised as an anti-feminist, white nationalist and Islamophobic person who shows little respect for other people's religious beliefs. These labels were made by Fox News and the Southern Poverty Law Centre. She has also been vocal against European countries accepting refugees or migrants from other countries such as Asia or Africa, believing it's a step towards white genocide. Molyneux too holds extreme views. He believes that climate change is a hoax, and he even goes as far as calling single mothers as a demographic terrible people. This comment was made on his YouTube video on his channel, with a video titled "The Truth About Single Mothers." Clearly, with values such as these, public outrage is going to ensue, and it is the event organisers' responsibility to provide the public with a safe setting for their event. Molyneux and Southern are inflicting hatred upon the audience, so clearly it was expected to lead to violence, as seen in previous examples. Whilst we understand that there is no guarantee that there would definitely have been an unsafe situation if this were to be the case, the Victoria Police would have cancelled the event. Instead, well aware of the potential risks, the event still proceeded, and clearly the amount of resources required would come at a cost, ultimately keeping the public safe. This leads to my third and final point tonight, and that is that by choosing to not pay for police protection at an event such as this is putting public safety at risk. Shows of this nature are subject to violent outbursts, and hence it's the police's right to ensure public safety, and it is the event organiser whose job is to ensure this, no matter what the cost. As quoted, the victims of politically motivated violence and intimidatory conduct at public events are no less entitled to proper police protection merely because they purchased a ticket to participate in an event. By purchasing a ticket to an event, a guest has right to safety, which our second speaker, Neve, will further elaborate on. Ultimately, these protection bills are put in place for a reason. The sole responsibility of the police is to ensure the safety of the public. When holding an event so easily subject to controversy, where the topic relates so directly to other people, it's naive not to expect a response from other perspectives. Putting in place precautions by the police to oversee the event shouldn't be questionable, and if they valued the lives of the public and genuinely cared that no one was hurt, that was simply just an event to discuss their own opinions, then there should be no problem overtaking accountability for necessary safety measures. Further to this, the event organisers are only billed if there are a large amount of police officers required, which in this case there was. If this number of police are required, should we not reconsider the need to hold an event such as this? Is there not another format for them to hold an event like this which would not negate the need for mass police protection and larger bills? At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we must question, what good are these speakers doing to society by constructing a war zone filled with violence? The world has enough violence and hate talk, so why did they feel the need to spread these extremist values across the world and choose to not support necessary safety measures? This being said, however, the nation Australia granted these people freedom of speech, so to decline a payment for ensuring public safety is simply irrational. Police Minister Lisa Neville comments, "Police are always well prepared, they've got the equipment, they've got the powers they need to do this, and they will not sit by and let people cause harm to each other or other innocent people in the community." Thank you.
I now call upon the second affirmative speaker, Jess Dickinson.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the Victoria Police should not have billed the organisers of the Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne, and we, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. Our first speaker, Cassie, has explained to you the danger of the precedent set by the police's prior billing to the organisers axiomatic, as well as that their billing undermines democracy and freedom of speech within Australia. I will speak to you about how axiomatic are not at fault for the damage caused by protesters, and that in accordance with similar situations, the price that Axiomatic are required to pay is far out of proportion to the services gained. Before I begin my arguments, I will refute the negative team's case. The first affirmative speaker argued that the nature of the event caused the violence which occurred on the night. But as I will later explain, it is not simply the event which caused the disruption. The protesters which caused the chaos at the Axiomatic event were never forced to attend. The protest group had a choice whether to attend or not, and whether to react with violence or not, and hence ultimately were the cause of the disruption. She also argued that Lauren Southern was detrimental to free speech. However, her extreme views give a platform for healthy discussion and debate. Banning free speech does not ban thought, and it's imperative that all people are entitled to voice their opinions to ensure diversity in our community without having to pay a large sum of money just to get their point across. Now, my first argument is that the police should not have billed Axiomatic, as the disorder and chaos was the fault of the protesters and not Axiomatic. Under the Victoria Police Fees and Regulations section, it states that the Victoria Police has the right to charge any event organiser for the use of police resources. However, the police would not primarily act Southern and Molyneux's event, instead attending the violent protest outside of the building. Victoria Police stated that Southern and Molyneux resumed their comparably non-violent speech, while protesters outside threw rocks at a building and at buses. 4 people were ejected from the venue, and 1 man was arrested for assaulting a police officer. The blame for these violent actions cannot be placed entirely on Axiomatic, especially when considering the extensive arrangements they had made in an attempt to minimise the danger associated with the event. Southern's acknowledgement of and addressing of the expected danger serves as evidence that the fault is not theirs. She quotes, "The fierce opposition to this event by the extreme left elements of Melbourne has been breathtaking in their determination to make it as difficult as possible for us to bring this tour here. We've decided to keep the venue secret as long as possible by asking you to make your way to a train station in the general vicinity where we are busing people to the final venue. For these security reasons, Southern kept the venue a secret, a fact to which the opposing protesters went out of their way to overcome, before creating the disorder that Axiomatic have themselves been billed for. Some have suggested that Southern intended to cause a riot, citing her quote, "I hope to cause a chaos." However, this overlooks the context of the statement. What Southern actually stated in this interview was, "I hope to cause chaos in a good way." The addition of the second half of this quote changes the meaning entirely. The implications of this comment may be unknown, but it is more than likely that a good way does not refer to the violent acts of protest which occurred, and rather to a sparking of political debate. Furthermore, the protest group responsible for this disorder, Campaign Against Racism and Fascism, did have the prior intent of causing chaos, sharing details of the event on their own Facebook page. Their previous posts show multiple similar acts of violence, advertised frequent protests, and encouraged disorder. In preparation for a similar protest against Nigel Farage when the venue had been moved, they quoted, "Maybe they didn't want a scene, all we know is he'll be disappointed." This implies their intent to cause chaos, and yet the Victoria Police overlooked this clear evidence, instead billing Axiomatic. Similar posts were made by them as well regarding the protests of the Southern and Molyneux event, telling protesters, "Bring yourselves, your friends, and your hatred of this fascist filth." As we've stated before, Southern and Molyneux were aware of the controversy surrounding their opinions, and so went out of their way to ensure that the details of the event were not public knowledge. Axiomatic are in no way culpable for the disorder and chaos caused by the protesters, and had the protesters not attempted to disrupt the event, there would have been no need for this policing, and hence Axiomatic should not have been billed. My second argument is that the bill Axiomatic are expected to pay is unnecessarily expensive, especially when compared to similar political events, and they should not have been billed this substantial sum. The event has been compared consistently to the case of Milo Yiannopoulos, whose event organisers were billed $50,000 after his Melbourne event by the Victoria Police. Although this case is unjust for many of the same reasons, there are some major differences which make the billing of the Southern and Molyneux event appear even more senseless. Yiannopoulos' event sparked a protest of some 600 attendees, which quickly turned violent, and according to The Age, resulted in groups beating each other with sticks and an eventual 2 arrests. Due to this damage, the organisers of Milo Yiannopoulos' event were then billed around $50,000, which according to the ABC was issued after the protest. This is the biggest difference between the 2 events because, as our first speakers already discussed, Southern was billed prior to the event even occurring, a fact which the Victoria Police have not defended using any substantiated reason, and in fact refused to comment on exactly what the $68,000 was being spent on. This price is $18,000 larger than Yiannopoulos', and with an ensuing protest of at most 1/3 of the size, simply does not add up. The cost of this bill was significantly greater than it needed to be, and Axiomatic should not have been billed this substantial and unnecessary sum. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria Police's billing of Axiomatic was frankly unjust. The chaos caused by protesters was by no fault of Axiomatic, especially when considering the lengths they went to in order to minimise the danger of any ensuing protests. When compared with similar protests, Axiomatic have not been billed a fair price, and the vagueness of the Victoria Police statements only emphasises the lack of sense in the choice to bill such a substantial sum of money. Axiomatic should not have been billed for the policing of their event in Melbourne.
I now call upon the second negative speaker, Neve McCormack.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the Victoria Police should not have billed the organisers of the Lawrence Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. We, as the negative team, strongly disagree with this statement. Our first speaker, Sophie, has talked to you about how events like this are notorious for violence, that Lawrence Southern was initially denied of an Australian visa, and that by choosing not to pay for police protection at an event such as this, you are putting public safety at risk. Tonight I'll be talking to you about the legalities of the bill. However, before I begin my debate, I'd like to point out some flaws in the opposition's argument. The first speaker tried to imply that freedom of speech was targeted. However, freedom of speech was not a target. The fee is to do with the services provided by the police to protect the safety of the community and the event, and the cost had nothing to do with freedom of speech. The second speaker tried to imply that the protesters should have been given the fee and not the event organisers. However, the protesters have a right to protest, and currently there is no law or regulation which states protesters have to supply the fee to the police. However, there is state requirements that states the event organisers may be required to pay the fee for the services provided, and I'll go on to explain this later on in my speech. The second speaker has also tried to explain to you that the event organisers made sure that they were letting out the location last minute, so that they did all they can to not expect protesters to come. However, due to the controversial topic and history with similar events requiring police, such as the Milo Yiannopoulos event in Sydney of December last year, that I'll explain later on in my speech, it is reasonable to be expecting or aware of the possibility that protesters would come Therefore, police would be required and regulation fees would apply. Now moving to my first point, as to why the Police Department of Victoria are legally obligated to bill the event organisers. Under the current Victorian Police Regulation Statement and the National Policing Guidelines on charging for police services, fees were introduced to promote the efficient and equitable use of Victorian police resources. It states that the regulations prescribed fees imposed for the provision of certain services is to ensure that the cost of providing the services is recovered. The fees and charges for the services are established based on the cost of delivering the services at the time. The regulations provide a vigorous framework for the use of by government entities when considering, developing and reviewing regulatory fees. The cost recovery guidelines ensures that the cost arrangements in Victoria are transparent, efficient, effective and consistent with legislative requirements and government policy. In fact, the cost to the Victorian Police Department for providing these services is in some cases well above what is currently recovered. For example, the total revenue generated under the current regulations in 2014 was at $10.5 million. However, the actual cost of delivering these services was $12.6 million. Therefore, with these regulations in place, placed by the state and the national policy guidelines, it is clear that the bill set was thought out with great detail and was relevant with the services provided. Again, to outline the Victorian Police mission, it is to provide a safe, secure and orderly society by serving the community and the law. This is in order to preserve the peace, protect life and help those in need of assistance. The application of charges for certain police services gives an important message to those who require police for their events about the actual cost of services provided. With this information and the regulations outlined under the Victorian Police Regulations Statement and the National Policing Guidelines, the organisers of the event should have been aware to include possible fee costs into their budget in case police are required. And considering past events of similar topics, there has been a regular pattern of police showing up as a result of violent protests, and this is not the first time events have been billed for police service. In December last year, Nuriootpa held a forum in Melbourne, in which he talked about similar topics to the one Lauren and Stefan discussed at their event. Milo was also billed for police services, as it is routine and outlined in various guidelines, including the National Policing Guidelines on charging for police services. The event organisers should have factored police bills into their budget, as it was very likely, when looking at the history of similar events, that police would have come to ensure the safety of the community. It was irresponsible and naive for the event organisers to refuse to pay the bill. Now to my second point, that the event organisers should have been aware of the state's Code of Practice for Events. Under the Code of Practice for Events by the Victorian State, a close working relationship between security personnel and police needs to be established. The officer in charge of the local police station must be given notice of the event, its location and the number of people attending. Furthermore, and more importantly, for larger events with over 5,000 patrons, Victorian Police will attend on a fee for a service basis. This is not a replacement for appropriate levels of security staff, but a required addition. For the organisers to say they did not ask for police to come is a cop-out and shows that they were not fully aware and did not understand or ignored the codes of Victorian State Police Department. Because the event ticket sales was over 5,000 people, the Victorian Police were obligated to attend and provide safety for the event. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clearly stated through multiple legal documents provided by the Victorian State and Police Department what the requirements are for police to attend an event. It is an obligation for the Victorian Police to attend the event and also charge for the services of the event. It is clear that organisers were not aware of these requirements and regulations or ignored them and refused to pay the bill. Thank you for listening.
call upon the third affirmative speaker, Georgia Thomas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the Victoria Police should not have billed the organisers of the Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. And as the affirmative team, we strongly agree with this statement. The first negative speaker stated that we do not wish for extremist values to be spread in Australia. However, this is a hasty generalisation fallacy, as it is assumed that this is the opinion of all Australian citizens, when this is clearly not true. Those that attended the Southern and Molyneux event in Victoria clearly wanted to hear what Southern and Molyneux had to say, and so it cannot be assumed that these views are not wanted by all of Australia. That makes this a hasty generalisation fallacy because the negative team has assumed that all of Australia do not want extremist views to be shared in Australia. However, the views that Southern and Molyneux promote were clearly wanting to be heard by those who attended their event. The first negative speaker also stated that the organisers struggled with the events of Southern and Molyneux being cancelled until they could finally hold one in Melbourne. However, this is simply not true. In Australia specifically, Southern and Molyneux successfully held events in both Perth and Brisbane as well as Melbourne. And whilst these similarly incited protests as the one in Melbourne did, our first speaker, Cassie, clearly stated that these were adequately handled by the police in those other cities and they were not billed an extensive amount like they were in Melbourne. So while the negative teams tried to tell you that they struggled to hold events in other cities around Australia, this is simply not the case, and they were adequately handled by police in a different manner. The first negative speaker additionally spoke of how Southern has been labelled an Islamophobe and a homophobe by the campaign against racism and fascism. However, this is clearly a biased source, as this campaign organised the protests against Southern and Molyneux in all the cities around Australia, and so therefore the organisation will naturally denounce the speakers in a negative light and portray them negatively to the audience they're attempting to target with their protesting events. And that additionally similarly does not reflect the positive view of Southern and Molyneux that are held by many of their supporters and those who attended the event, which relates back to the hasty generalisation that the negative team made in assuming that all Australians do not want these views to be spread. The first negative speaker additionally stated that Southern and Molyneux should respect the procedures of the Victoria Police and accept the charge. However, as our second speaker just stated, the damage was clearly not the fault of Southern and Molyneux and would not have occurred were it for the protesters. And so Axiomatic should never have been billed in the first place. If they should just respect the procedures and accept the bill, then they're accepting responsibility when, in actual fact, we've made it clear that the protests were not their fault and that the police presence would not have been required if the protests did not occur on the street outside the event, which Southern and Molyneux and Axiomatic, the organisers, attempted to be held safely, securely and peacefully through hiding the venue and other extensive measures such as that. So to suggest they should simply respect the procedures of the police and accept the charges. Additionally, when these charges were not employed by police in other states such as Queensland and Western Australia, then it goes against the responsibility of the protesters in actually being the ones to incite the disruption that occurred on the streets of Melbourne. The first negative speaker also stated that it would be naive for Southern and Molyneux and their organisers to not expect a response from differing perspectives. However, our second speaker, Jess, made it evident in her speech that Southern and Molyneux were clearly aware of this and went to extreme measures to keep the venue hidden as not to incite protests or disrupt the people that actually wanted to attend their event so it could remain safe and secure and would not require additional police presence for disruptive protests. She stated that they hired their own bodyguards and kept the location secret until the very last minute. So to suggest that they did not expect a response is an enormous overstatement. They clearly went to extensive lengths to ensure the venue was safe for the people attending it, as well as for those who may end up protesting to a small degree. They hired the bodyguards to ensure it was safe for all people and all citizens and upheld their right to do so to their patrons. Leading into that, the first negative speaker also stated that the guests of the event, as having bought tickets and being guests, had a right to their personal safety. However, their personal safety and their right to it was clearly threatened by the protesters, not by Southern and Molyneux or the organisers of their event. So again, as Jess has stated, the responsibility for the violence that occurred and the disruption that occurred, and therefore, consequently, the breaching of the personal safety right that the attendees of the event had, lies actually on the protesters and not the organisers of the event themselves. Because their personal right to safety was breached by the protesters, it does not make sense to suggest that Southern and Molyneux and their organisers should have to be the ones to pay for the damage that was caused and the use of police resources. So to suggest that the guests had the right to safety as attendees of the event makes sense. However, to suggest that this right to safety was breached by Southern, Molyneux or their event organisers is illogical, because we've made clear that clearly the onus of responsibility is on the protesters and not the organisers. The second negative speaker stated that Southern, Molyneux and their organisers should have allocated funds for possible police presence. However, our first speaker, Cassie, clearly described how Southern and Molyneux had actually hired security, and that was reiterated by our second speaker, Jess. So they hired this security to oversee their event, and they anticipated perhaps some protest. However, the disruptive protest that was much larger and occurred outside the streets of Melbourne where their event was being held by the Campaign for Racism and Fascism is what incited the additional police presence. So Southern and Molyneux did to some extent allow for possible police presence in hiring their security so that police would not have to deploy additional resources. So they did allocate and consider for this. However, for the negative team to suggest this disregards that completely, and they assume that Southern and Molyneux did not consider this, when in actual fact that is not the case. The second negative speaker additionally stated that the cost that Southern and Molyneux had been billed was relevant with the services provided. However, our second speaker, Jess, clearly stated in her entire argument that the bill that Axiomatic are expected to pay is unnecessarily expensive, and that when compared to similar political events like Nuriootpa, when he performed in Melbourne, he was only billed $50,000 after the event, whereas in comparison, Southern and Molyneux were billed a much larger amount prior to the event occurring before the police could even estimate the amount of police resources that would be required. So and additionally the protesters at Milo's event were about 600, and whereas the protest at Southern and Molyneux's event was comparatively much smaller, barely a third of the size. So the damage after Milo's event was what justified the cost of his bill. However, because they were billed prior, that was not justified at all. So ladies and gentlemen, the billing of Axiomatic for the policing of Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux's event in Melbourne was unjust, preemptive, excessive, and very clearly should not have occurred. Our first speaker, Cassie, discussed how the decision to charge the organisers prior to the event was unjustified and sets a dangerous precedent for controversial events in Melbourne. She also spoke of how such action undermines freedom of speech and democracy in Melbourne and Australia more broadly. Our second speaker, Jess, spoke of how the organisers were not responsible for the police presence, but rather it is the protesters who are culpable, and therefore Axiomatic should not have been charged. She also explained how the amount charged was out of proportion with the services that were provided to the event. The imposition of extensive fees for the performance of essential police purposes has been unduly thrust upon Axiomatic without substantial reasoning or fair consideration. It's clear that the organisers of Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux's event in Melbourne should not have been charged for their event. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Grace Edwards.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Grace Edwards and I am the third speaker for the negative team. Tonight I will further convince you why the Victoria Police should have billed the organisers of the Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. I'd like to start with rebuttal against negative team before I sum up my team's case. Firstly, starting off with some fallacies, the opposition team used the fallacies of a slippery slope, as the first speaker stated that by charging the organisation, we are not only starting a worrying trend through Australia, but a path of silencing protesters. However, this claim is a slippery slope as, firstly, there is no evidence that backs up this claim, as events have been billed before, yet events still happen. And because of this, making claims that they cannot prove the underlying slippery slope analogy, that it will apparently get worse. The second fallacy that they stated tonight was, that they used tonight, was appeal to emotions, as the first speaker stated that the police's actions were intimidating. However, the police were acting only under law, as that is their job. The police were not playing mental games with the organisers. Police do not have the power to intimidate, as they are at a lower status that they cannot. Leaders, however, such as Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump can intimidate, however, policemen cannot. Also, the third speaker claimed that we made a generalisation fallacy by saying that we, the negative team, assumed that the general public of Australia do not want to hear extremist views. However, through history, we have seen countless times that these hate speeches have not been accepted well by the public. If we take Hitler's loud and completely racist views upon the Jewish population of Germany, we shared through his speeches, we see that, firstly, this was not taken well and belittled minorities, and this led to absolutely detrimental effects upon Germany. We don't want to repeat history and therefore can assume that the population of Australia do not want to hear these views. Now to rebut the opposition team's points with the help of my team's points. The second speaker of the opposition team stated that the organisers' extreme views were a platform for discussion. However, as my first speaker, Sophie, claimed that the organisers' views were there to start chaos. The opposition team's second speaker claimed herself that the organisers, quote, wanted to cause chaos, however, in a good way. How do we define good, though? That is a complex definition. However, I'm sure we can all agree that good is not defined as hatred, racism, or fascism. My first speaker, Sophie, quoted in her speech that Miss Southern was expected to cause trouble, as the alt-right YouTube star made headlines since she touched down in Australia wearing a "It's okay to be white" t-shirt. On to Neve's speech. So the first speaker on the opposition team claimed that billing the organisations prior to the event was an extreme act. However, as Neve has outlined, by court of law, the police were required to bill the event and bill them accordingly, as they did. Southern and Molyneux were aware of the backlash, as there were no surprises at all as to what would have happened. If people hear about hate speeches that do not agree with the hate, of course they are going to turn up and share their own views. Furthermore, the first speaker stated that it was an intimidating act by police. However, I've already outlined that it was not intimidating but necessary, as they were required by law. The second speaker on the opposition team claimed that Victorian police have not defended why they charged a great sum of money, and moreover, they have not defended what they spent on it. However, as my second speaker has stated, that it was all under law to bill them, and this was to protect the public of Australia. There is no need to defend the costs of this. If you get a speeding fine for $140, you don't know where the $140 is going to go. You don't need to know. It's never justified, and they do not legally have to justify this cost. However, we must consider the time, materials and effort that the police would have put into arriving at that event and shutting it down. It was not free, and the policemen work their jobs to get their wages so they can feed themselves, really. And therefore, the cost was necessary. They needed to charge an event for such a large scale. The first speaker on the opposition team also claimed that by billing the organisers, we are undermining free speech, and furthermore that free speech was being targeted in this backlash by police. However, We understand that police were again acting under nothing but the law, as this is their job. They are bound to the law. This situation has nothing to do with free speech, as it was acting under hate speech, and by organising it, they were aware of what was going to happen. In addition to this, as Australians, we agree that we live in a multicultural society, and we are encouraged to be multicultural and learn about other cultures. This hate speech goes against every little part of that. If you are shutting down minorities and belittling people, what has that got to do with multiculturalism? Of course, the police were going to intervene on such a hate speech. It could be argued that this speech was an act of terrorism, as if this event were to be organised by ISIS, I'm sure everyone would feel a little bit different about it. On to sum up my team's case. My first speaker, Sophie, has outlined how the event at hand was not only violent and out of control, but also the dangers of this imposed on the public but posed dangers on the public. In addition to this, by not paying, it is threatening society. Furthermore, the organisers of this event were well aware for what could have happened, as they are known for inflicting speeches of hate to a large crowd, and this has happened before. They should have expected the public outrage to occur, and thus preempted that they may have been billed this large sum of money. My second speaker spoke about the legalities that surrounded this dispute, about the laws that state police must come to events such as this, in particular, the Victorian State Code of Practices for Events. Ultimately, my team have clearly argued why the Victoria Police should have billed the organisers of the Lawrence Southern and Stefan Molyneux tour in Australia for policing their event in Melbourne. Thank you.